I'm Seamless, and this is part 2 of this Wednesday's sound design request tutorial featuring a KOAN sound, sort of, made by Audeka. I suggest you watch the first part if you haven't. It'll be linked in the description. Go for it. So let's talk about, now, super in-depth cool things. So let's begin at the beginning with the 3x OSC here. Now, it never occurred to me to do this like this, but actually this sort of makes sense because now normally when I do pitch modulation, I use slide notes in the play or the piano roll, but that only works for FL plugins, which it's fine when you're using FL plugins. But if you want to do this sort of thing with like Maximus Massive, or FM8 or whatever, then you'll need to use actual manual pitch enveloping like this in the playlist. And this craziness sort of just not tonal, like none of this, like these are kind of notes for a second, but it's not, largely it's not a note. It's not saying a note. Why? And like that's not something that occurred to me. And then I realized if I thought about it, if I think about how like neuro tracks tend to go, this makes a lot of sense because the sounds are more rhythm based. They're more about rhythm and effective effects happening. Less about melody and tone and notes and all that kind of good stuff. So this kind of thing makes perfect sense. And now we're using the EQ here to make a bandpass shape. And this has lots of interesting impact on the sound. Unlike Harmor, when you use a filter inside that and it note follows, you can make it note follow. This doesn't really follow the notes except for when we manually make it follow the notes. And then for large part it does until we get to right here, this part. That happens. So like this original shape follows the notes and largely it stays above the fundamental tone. You can see like that's the fundamental, this is basically the second harmonic. But then for a second it comes back down to the fundamental. And that makes it sound rounder. Because what that's doing is it's driving the bass tone into the distortion harder than all the other harmonics. And that means it's drowning out all the other harmonics. And so it's going to sound more round. It's going to sound more, it's not going to have as much high frequency action as it did a minute ago. And that's kind of cool. The sort of Reese wobble quality that we're hearing is totally the result of the detuning here. Now this is detuned around the fundamental, which is to say one is detuned down and one is detuned up. Neither are actually the original note. And normally I would be a little bit weirded out by that, but given how we're pitching all over the place, it doesn't particularly matter. So that's how that works there. Now, normally I wouldn't stack this many EQs together, but to each their own. This is kind of what Audeka did as well. Audeka, when they made this project, this isn't their usual stuff. This is not like they had used other plugins to do what they normally do. And actually, I have a sample of what they normally do to kind of show you what this sound could morph into eventually if you kind of stick with it. And you can see why I went to them for help. And you may be thinking, well, why didn't you just show that? Well, the thing about this kind of sound, this sort of filtery, bandpassing, notch, Reese business, is that the basics are always all the same. Like I could explain the basics of how this works, as I did in the beginning of this video, and that could apply to anyone who's ever made this, even related to this sound ever. Like Noisia, KOAN, Belaine, Audeka, Disprove, me, like this. It's how the sound is originated. But the end point, the end process, I could even tell you how to do that, and you would not get the same sounds. It's just always going to be what the case is. And in this particular example, the sound is a little bit different just because they decided not to use outside third-party plugins, just for your sake. But this is still farther than I would have gotten. So let's talk about the Harmor. They even filled in the that's pretty good. They filled in the info here. What they're saying here is that if you load in the same sample into both parts, and then on one of them go into advanced and turn on side, like so, it's already on. What that'll do is it will create a mid-side difference between the stereo field and the mono field, and then you can resample stereo if you engage part linking, and where whenever you move a knob, another knob is moved apart from it. Yeah. Now, you see here that the sharpness knob actually got moved a little bit. That doesn't actually have any effect at all on the sound when there's not things like unison or prism or any kind of additive pitch movement engaged. I say additive pitch movement because phaser is additive gain changing, but additive pitch movement is what the sharpness knob will deal with. But for the time being, the sharpness knob is completely irrelevant. Same thing with the format mix. As long as the format is centered, the mix can be on or off, and there'd be no noticeable difference to the sound. Yeah. So what's happening here is that we're using the phaser. Now, why are we using the phaser? Well, the phaser is basically just a very specific filter in Harmor that mimics the result of a phaser. And I covered this in the Harmor tutorial that talks about phasers, I think last week. It's in my FL Basics in the series on Harmor. I have a whole thing about how the phaser works, and it's a lot of fun, really. But what they're doing here is that they're moving the width of the phaser, which changes the shape, and it has drastically interesting effects on how the sound moves. And it's more apparent if I turn the phaser off. You can look at the spectral image here. See, can I has more view? There it is. All right. So let's look at the sound. Well, it's normal. All right, you got that in your head. Now let's turn the phaser all the way on. Ah, look at that. Yeah. So the speed is off, the offset is centered, and the keyboard tracking is off, which means that if we don't move the width, it would actually stay where it will stay locked in position. And so when the width changes, it changes, the noticeable width of individual phaser bands, but it also moves bands in from above or below that wouldn't have been there originally because of the width change. Like that. See, if we just leave it alone, it just kind of stays there. So, phaser is basically a very out of control filter. That can be really cool when you control it. Yeah. I had it on a little bit harsh just so that you could see very clearly the effect of the phaser itself. Their use is a little bit more diffuse. So we control the phaser, and then we have this high band engaging, which is because when you filter stuff, you tend to lose things. That's not the one that's happening. It's this one. Yeah, you tend to lose. You're filtering things. You're taking out frequencies of the sound. That could negatively impact the sort of overall timbre of the sound. I typically tend to fix this with compression, multi-band compression. Low, mid, high, just crunch everything. That's just my way of doing it. Their way of doing it was manually bringing the highs back using an EQ and automating the band height. Now, I mentioned that they had this going on in the previous video where they had these multiple notches just kind of swinging around. They're using the peak controllers, which has in it an LFO that is completely unsynced. I believe you can make it synced. Yeah, because it's a product of tempo. If I make it faster, we go faster. But it's unsynced in the sense that it doesn't restart with each note press or even the song beginning. It just goes. It goes completely just by itself. Tight in tempo, but just by itself. So when you're linking these to a parameter, you right-click it, link the controller, and then in the internal controllers, you'll see everything about the peak LFO, the peak controllers. And of course, they renamed it because you can actually rename the names of specific plugins so that you know what they do. like this. You have notch LFO, notch LFO2, mod EQ, that kind of thing. Like you can rename stuff, and so their names will show up. And over here we have LFO, peak, and LFO. And normally when I talked about in the again the basic tutorial when I talked about the peak controller, you can talk about you can use the peak to register transient information as like say a side chaining thing. You can do that. Or you can have the LFO by itself, and you can do both. But they just decided to use LFO. Audeka is actually 3 guys, so I keep saying he, but I mean they. It's they, them, thus, and so that's pretty much a pretty straightforward setup there. Just to have auto super notching going on, and then it's the EQ where we're modding the high frequency, and then it's recorded into an Edison, and then this comes out over here. Now, people may wonder why, when you change the pitch of a sample on the fly, that happens. And this is because pitch, in terms of recorded audio, is 100% to do with speed. It's all about speed. And in fact, with audio at all, it's all about speed. If you play a signal faster, it gets higher in pitch, or slower, it gets lower in pitch. So the fastest and most direct way to change the pitch of a sample is to change how fast it plays. And of course, there's algorithms to not do that, because if you want to have a sample be the same length as it was originally but a higher pitch, then there's different pitch, time stretching algorithms. It's time stretching that does that will allow you to change the pitch but not change the length, and vice versa. Change the length without changing pitch. You can do that, but when we're just in basic resampling mode, which is to say that it samples it faster, it plays the sample faster or slower, then it'll change the size of the apparent size of the sample, which will be the pitch. So we have the pitch change, a new band pass, and then a high frequency band increase as well. This is not doing anything. I'll get rid of it. Over here we have the band pass filter. We have a distortion using the wave shaper, which is this is just like the slightest distortion ever made right here. Yaw and EQ. It's just an EQ. And a frequency split using Maximus. So what this is doing here is that each of these has only one band active, and the master band, but there are only one band active. And what we're doing here is we're splitting low, mid, and high like that, and then we're using this to create stereo. So we have the stereo enhancer, stereo shaper. They both kind of do the same thing. The stereo shaper is kind of the better choice, and then they use the panomatic over here to basically bring in a line, because when you do this sort of thing, it gets kind of phase weirdy, and then you use the panning thing to bring it in. Except that's what this phase knob is for. You can actually kind of do that too. And then you can also do this where you put like this is bringing a bit of the left into the right and a little bit of right to the left kind of thing. So you can even do negative. So if you wanted to balance it out, you could do it like that. Or so this here is pre and post. This is pre and post the faders over here. So if we did pre and then changed it with over here, then we could balance it the same way without having to use another plugin. Although I think the use of the Panomatic is kind of nice. It's kind of the classic. And then it goes out. And then it goes to a Maximus, which sole purpose here is to stereo close the low band so that the low bass is completely centered. Then there's a flanger, very low amount of instrument. And then there's an EQ. And then this mixer insert is being routed into another mixer insert because we ran out of effects. We have an EQ, a limiter that I turned off because they must have been monitoring very high. And then this EQ, which is the one that is modding the high frequencies here. Yeah. And then you have the sound. And like I said before, this is a very basic look at the large concept of neuro bass sort of creation. It's a bit easier these days, not just because Harmor exists and you could do that because the Harmor is awesome, but resampling is largely unnecessary unless you're doing like straight up sample mashing and destructive stuff like that, because you could put, like, most computers could handle having a billion effects that are just like, your basic chorus and filters and distortion or whatever. You can just have thousands of those, and you'll be pretty okay. In fact, in my track, Tachycardia, at the time was a pretty early example of me not using resampling to make that kind of a sound. But I mean, I'm not going to use that as an example of a successful version of that, because obviously people like Belane and Noisia and KOAN Sound do a much better job of it than I do, which is why I got Audeka, because they do a good job too. All right. Like the first video, this FLP will be in the description. The description of the video. If you have any questions about any of this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day.